Okay, we have time for questions, so please don't be shy, but introduce yourself if you would, and make sure to speak into the mic. Questions, comments for our panelists?
Hi, this is Ned Blackhawk again. Really enjoyed this session and wanted to ask David a question about North American mining and indigenous solidarity movements. My general understanding is that certain rural non-indigenous or white populations have often come to learn over time from their indigenous neighbors that they share a kind of future ecological world together, and have come to see how indigenous land rights and sovereignty and various kind of environmental and governmental land protections might also assist them in protecting, say, the headwaters of rivers that are going to flow downstream through their communities. And this is a relatively recent type of development that stands sometimes in marked contrast to many white communities' initial understandings of sovereignty's expressions in the 70s and 80s that were often very violent, hostile, and led certain places in northern Wisconsin to be termed the Mississippi of the North and so forth. I don't know if your work, and especially through cultural survival, has linked in or kind of been a part of any of those kind of conversations, because what strikes me in from your talk and from these mining solidarities that I'm somewhat familiar with is the extent to which these are Canadian corporations exerting certain degrees of influence that sometimes require solidarities of all kinds to resist them.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot there. You're absolutely right that I think historically and to a large extent even today, we see a disconnect between non-indigenous communities and indigenous communities around this question of sovereignty. But I think it's fair to say that that is changing. And not only with regard to mining, I think I'm in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, the Twin Cities, and there in the year 1998, 1999, we saw an extraordinary coalition of Anglos, of citizen settlers, colonial citizens, indigenous folks, the American Indian movement, people from the environmental community came together to try to stop the reroute of a highway, of a major transportation corridor. And they wanted to stop this road from coming through this area for several reasons that really get at the crux of what you're saying. One of those reasons was because it was going through Coldwater Spring, which is viewed by many Dakota, Lakota, Nakota people as sacred. But it was also going right through a community of white folks, settler colonial people whose homes were going to be removed. And this was also an opportunity for the radical environmental group Earth First to launch an anti-road campaign. And so they imported many of the tactics that they had been using in the western United States in forest lands into this urban area. And so you had these folks who, for their own various reasons, came together around this particular campaign, and through that began to understand and pay attention to and then respect, I think, above all, questions of indigenous sovereignty and solidarity, even when, and especially when it was contested, the claims that indigenous peoples were making about the sacred nature of that land were highly contested by the state government. And that gave the non-indigenous folks, the settler colonials, an opportunity to really have a conversation about their place and their responsibility and their role and their relationship to that land and to the spring. And so I guess one other last thing I would say is the organization Global Response has, from the very beginning when we were founded in 1990, been very clear that so much of the history of the environmental movement in Europe and the United States has been a colonial history. And so much of that history has involved us, and I include myself in that because I'm a part of this organization, without permission, without consent, maybe with consultation, but certainly without consent, defining critical areas that need to be preserved and conserved and other areas that didn't, and then defining the terms of those struggles. And so global response only operates on the basis of requests and invitations from indigenous and other communities around the globe to launch its campaigns. And this campaign in Ecuador was one of those, one such campaign. So, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I would like to make a comment to Professor's case of mining in Ecuador. Thanks, David, for bringing that to this forum, because I don't know the particular case of the INTAC. I believe it started 10 years ago, before the Constitution. But I think I will totally understand the community of INTAC in its distrust of the state, because in one of the problems that we face in Ecuador is being so immensely rich in natural resources and needing those resources to untap the unlimited potential knowledge-based economy that we're trying to build. So I totally acknowledge and understand that distrust, because for so many years we lack of a state, we lack of a regulatory body that will defend these people from predatory multinational companies. But despite being this a particular case, I think you raise a more important question that we're facing right now. It's how we do that. I mean, how we move from the president used to say that we are sitting in a pot gold, literally pot gold of mine and oil. I mean, and we try really hard to come up with different mechanisms, and that sometimes we feel are not understood by the world. We come up with this net avoid mechanism to try to keep our oil on the ground, and trying to the market economy understand this mechanism of net avoid emission, trying to let's say a price on it, and having the world to contribute through that mechanism to help us to keep the oil on the ground. So I think those conundrums we will still facing. We hope that we are not out of the problem, out of the woods yet, because we try to strengthen the regulation bodies that will not allow that happen. I mean, I totally understand. I mean, I promise you that I won't pollute, that I won't let others pollute your water resources. Why will they believe us? I mean, why besides having this constitution, besides fighting for this constitution as hard as we fought for having those nature rights there, and again, to go back to the question that I posed to you in this morning, institutionality, how we make those bodies independently from the government or agency government interest, regulate in the best interests of the people. But then also you have another question, and you mentioned the lack of consistency, we can say like that, having such a green constitution, having this resolution on indigenous people that requires the prior consent for natural resource exploitation. Are we having the right to discuss, but not make it binding? But how you also reconciliate the interests of these communities and the national interests and the need of these resources. And I think we need to think about that. I mean, how you create those two-way communications. So you bring everybody in the conversation. So I don't have answers. I just add more questions to your questions, and I think this is an open discussion. Because we're trying to achieve all, and we need to recognize their trade-offs. Of course, there are trade-offs, and I think acknowledging them and trying to create the institutionality to defend those rights, I think is the road that we need to explore in order to try to achieve that.
I've already spoken so much. Thank you.
If there are no other, sir.
not a question as much as a request. I'd like to get a copy of the Protecting Your Communities booklet. Is that on your website, David, or could you put it on the meeting's website? This
Sure.
meeting's website?
Yes, I can go. I have 2 copies here in Espanol, but you can download it on the website. I can give you that.
I wanted to offer our panelists the opportunity to ask one another questions, or at least identify themes or concerns that emerged for you as you were listening to your co-panelists talk. I mean, there are clearly considerable overlaps here around environmental issues, around the treatment of migrants, both internal and external to the nation, around urbanization, around planning, around invisible labor, I think, just to name a few. So this might be a time for any of you to weigh in, and so Mabel, please.
Yeah, actually, I do have actually a question for David and Jhon, and this was also perhaps maybe a question also for the first panel as well. And this goes to David's question about being post-status. I mean, is it possible to have freedom from inclusion? I've actually been finding Denise De Silva's work actually very useful, especially because I'm trying to write the racial back into architectural discourse, which is very, very difficult because architecture is so pragmatic and it sees itself outside of the social, quite frankly. But what's interesting, I think, in her work is that she says that the emergence of the modern subject in the 18th through Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinking allows for the production of inequalities, and in particular, the racial becomes strategic and spatial, right? This idea, she has an idea of globality that is constantly engulfing as the European went around the world and engulfed lands and people. And in that process, produced inequalities that are still persistent. And her question is always, why is it that brown and black bodies are always marked as something that can be murdered? I mean, that is her question. That it's always something that never can face the horizon of life, as she would write, but always the horizon of death. And that those inequalities always persist, even within the rhetoric of inclusion, which is what the Constitution of Ecuador is attempting to do, as your diagram shows. But these inequalities nonetheless persist. So she is constantly asking, you know, can we have something other than the nation? Can we have something other than the citizen? Can we have, you know, is there potentially emerging out of Ecuador some other sort of model for collective living? So that's my question.
Bueno, no necesariamente voy a tratar de responder a la profesora Mabel, pero sí quería decir algunas cosas. La primera es que estoy muy impresionado con los indicadores que presentó la profesora Vesla. Me pareció muy impactante y revelador que existan en los Estados Unidos estas brechas de desigualdades entre grupos afrodescendientes, latinos y asiáticos frente a otros grupos. Y se me ocurre que es importante que establezcamos una especie de partner, una especie de coordinación junto con la profesora Hazel, y para ver si podemos hacer investigaciones conjuntas sobre desigualdades raciales en Estados Unidos y en América Latina. Porque en América Latina, cuando hablamos de desigualdades raciales, no pensamos en los Estados Unidos. ¿Sí? Pensamos de que Estados Unidos es el sueño americano y todo está muy bien acá, pero sabemos de que no es así. El segundo punto que quería plantear es que en este panel se habla de las luchas por la desigualdad, y yo no me he referido a estas luchas por la desigualdad. Y si bien no es para hacer otra ponencia, solamente quiero anotar que nuestros pueblos afrodescendientes tienen una lucha constante e histórica contra la desigualdad. Sobre todo porque buscamos, a través de la estrategia de la inclusión ciudadana, buscamos el precioso objetivo de la libertad sobre todo de la libertad de ser humano. Que no se nos mire como negros, sino que se nos mire como personas, sin prejuicios raciales, sin el peso del color de la piel, sin el mito del esclavo, como decía mi compañero indígena, que hablábamos sobre Fanon, que habla sobre el mito del esclavo, que pesa sobre la construcción de mi etos afrodescendiente. Ese mito que hace que cada vez que yo salga de mi casa, me ven como negro. Y yo no quiero que me vean como negro, quiero que me vean como un ser humano que puede llegar a cualquier parte que cualquier persona puede estar. Entonces, sobre las luchas, nosotros en este periodo del año 2000, a partir de la tercera conferencia mundial contra el racismo, celebrada en Durban, Sudáfrica, a partir de esta tercera conferencia, los pueblos afrodescendientes de las Américas nos hemos movilizado por dos objetivos fundamentales. El primero son las acciones afirmativas, las cuales he hablado aquí, que ustedes la conocen en los Estados Unidos desde la lucha de los derechos civiles. Y segundo son las reparaciones. Consideramos de que el capitalismo, la modernidad europea, deben reparar a los afrodescendientes por los daños causados por la esclavitud. Fueron 400 años como esclavos produciendo riquezas para Europa y riquezas para el capitalismo. ¿Y qué nos ha traído esta producción de riquezas para el capitalismo? La desigualdad étnica, el racismo estructural, la falta de oportunidades que las mostramos en las diapositivas. Por eso hay una lucha constante, muy fuerte a nivel de América Latina de los movimientos sociales afrodescendientes. Es una línea de investigación importante que estamos desarrollando en nuestra universidad y con algunos colegas en la región. Ahora, y finalmente, respecto al tema de la geografía, yo sí creo, profesora Mabel, de que si bien la arquitectura, cómo le incorporamos al tema de la arquitectura, la raza, pero si miramos la arquitectura desde el punto de vista del diseño de las ciudades, del diseño de los barrios, del diseño de los distritos, nos podemos dar cuenta de que se hacen diseños con una perspectiva racial. Porque uno se pregunta, ¿por qué en los lugares donde viven los afrodescendientes y los indígenas carecen de servicios básicos? ¿Por qué ocurre? Porque aquí hay una geografía intencionalmente racial. Hay una segregación espacial muy impactante que viola los derechos humanos de los afrodescendientes.
Mabel, would you be interested in responding to any of the last part of that about urban planning and urban design, and or this would be your chance to do so.
I mean, I would just simply add that, in this country, the logics of segregation and even the emergence of slavery and black codes and how that literally gets written into the way in which both space is represented, regulated, and then occupied from the founding of this country, to having Washington, D.C. within a slave-holding state, which was no accident, all the way till now is that those logics of segregation were always about keeping certain bodies away from other bodies, where other bodies can be more exploited and were expendable in relationship to other bodies. And so I think that that's, again, it's a model that's going on in Qatar. I mean, this is exactly why, certain bodies are expendable within work, within construction sites, and other bodies are not. So.
I think we've reached our end here, but I want to say I think you've also, in addition to doing such a fine job with this panel, you've done a wonderful job of setting us up for the next one. And I'll remind everybody that according to the program, we will have lunch for the next hour and a half and be back in this room at 3 o'clock. So please join me in thanking our panel.